Madam President, if you were to approach a random person on the street in any city in America today and say, "Who is George Floyd?" I could all but guarantee you that you'd be met with a quick response. They would tell you about their horror at seeing this video of him being killed at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. And that, sadly, he was not the first victim of this type of crime, and that his death has now mobilized Americans of all races, ages, and backgrounds to demand action. A friend of Mr. Floyd's for more than 35 years said, "Everybody in the world knows who George Floyd is today. Presidents, kings, and queens, they know George Floyd." And it's true. His name and face are everywhere. He's the subject of incredible artwork, passionate speeches, and dinner table conversations. He's the reason for marches and demonstrations in cities from Houston to Minneapolis to London to Sydney. And today, after 2 weeks of grieving, the Floyd family will finally lay their beloved brother, father, and friend to rest in his hometown of Houston, Texas. Over the past 2 weeks, I've joined the chorus of voices calling for justice for Mr. Floyd. The first step is underway now that the officers have been charged. But this alone is not enough. Our country has a responsibility to do the best we can to prevent another family from burying their son or daughter as a result of excessive force by a police officer. People of all races are now actively engaged in a national conversation about the racial injustices that exist in our country, one that's deeply needed and long overdue. I want to assure the people of Texas that these conversations are happening here in the United States Senate as well. Our friend and colleague, Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, briefed the Republican conference today on the package of bills he's developing, with help from a group of our members to combat the racial injustice that still exists in our country today, particularly as it applies to law enforcement. This is a product of discussions that Leader McConnell and I and others have had that would make real and lasting changes in communities across our countries. I'm proud to be part of the discussion led by Senator Scott, and I want to commend both him and the Majority Leader for their leadership and sense of urgency, one that we all feel. I think the necessary changes begin within our criminal justice system. Despite calls from some to defund or even disband the police, I believe these steps would do far more harm than good. It's not the right answer. Instead, we need to do a top-to-bottom review of our criminal justice system, something that has not happened in more than 50 years. Senators Peters and Graham and I have introduced a bill to create a National Criminal Justice Commission that would do just that. Over the course of 18 months, the commission would examine our criminal justice system and provide recommendations on specific changes that should be made by Congress. I've recommended this bill be included in the legislation Senator Scott is developing, and I'm eager to work with him and all our colleagues in the coming days in the hope of gaining broad bipartisan support. As we know, that's the only way things get done around here is with bipartisan support. And I can't think of anything more urgent at this particular time than we demonstrate we can come together and rise above our partisan differences in addressing this very real need. Of course, there's nothing we can do to reverse what happened in Minneapolis, but there's a lot that can be done to prevent the name of another black person in America from becoming a trending hashtag. A former classmate of Mr. Floyd's at Jack Yates High School said he always would say, "I'm going to change the world." And while this is certainly not the way he or anyone could have fathomed, his story is sure to have a lasting impact on our country's history. So today I'd like to offer once again my condolences to the entire Floyd family for their loss. I had the privilege of speaking with them on the telephone yesterday. Rodney Floyd reminded me that the family was from Houston, Texas, and he said, "We want Texas-size justice." And I said, "Mr. Floyd, you will have it." In the wake of this tragedy, I hope we can come together and deliver that change. So I appreciate Senator Scott and Leader McConnell leading the charge here in the Senate, and look forward to sharing more details of this proposal soon. Madam President, on another matter, since the CARES Act was signed into law more than 2 months ago, millions of small businesses, I think 4.5 million businesses, have gotten loans from the Paycheck Protection Program. This program has allowed restaurants, retailers, manufacturers, farmers, and small businesses from virtually every sector of the economy to stay afloat and keep their employees on payroll. Dr. Nora Walker operates a pulmonary practice in San Antonio, my hometown, which experienced a near stop on patient visits once COVID-19 began to soar in March. Payroll is her largest expense. And without that source of revenue, she and her husband were worried they wouldn't be able to pay the practice's 3 employees. But then the lifeline came in the form of the PPP loan. They applied for a $26,000 loan, and they received the funds 2 weeks later. And because of that funding, these 3 employees could stay on the payroll as Dr. Walker continued her practice via telemedicine. Her practice is a great example of the PPP beneficiaries who don't receive enough attention, the small employers who took out small loans to help a small number of workers in a very big way. From the truly small businesses to those that have grown their footprint in our state, the PPP has been essential to the survival of these businesses and to the livelihood of their employees. As I've spoken to small businesses throughout the state, I've repeatedly heard how vital the PPP has been. But that praise has been coupled with requests to make improvements in the program to ensure that it delivers the most efficient and maximum benefit. Last week, we took the first step in making some of those changes through the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, which was signed into law by the President on Friday. It extends the amount of time businesses can use these funds from 8 weeks to 24 weeks, and it reduces the portion of the loan that must be used on payroll in order to be forgiven from 75% to 60%. Many of our restaurants and other businesses that had simply closed their doors said, "There's no way we can spend our PPP loan on payroll when our business isn't even open." So this provides flexibility for them and others. In a nutshell, it gives small business owners the ability to use these loans when and where they're needed. In the short term, these changes will be critical to protecting jobs and supporting small businesses as they reopen their doors following a coronavirus-induced shutdown. And the jobs report we got just last week provides great hope and promise that this recovery will come soon. In the longer term, we need to ensure that these loans don't end up creating even more burdens for small businesses down the road. Under normal circumstances, businesses can deduct their expenses from their taxable income. Of course, the Paycheck Protection Program covers the cost of many of these expenses, and there's some confusion, particularly at Treasury, with how businesses should handle their taxes. I believe the intent of Congress was to allow businesses to continue deducting those expenses. Basically, we were trying to get the money where it was needed most, the fastest. And by allowing them to continue to deduct those expenses, we do that. But the guidance recently issued by the IRS said the opposite. Well, it's fair to say that this has led to confusion and frustration among many, and Congress needs to take action to eliminate the misunderstanding. Last month, I introduced a bill to make clear that small businesses can still deduct their expenses that were paid for with a forgiven paycheck protection loan for their taxes. Now, I know this is an unusual circumstance, but isn't the pandemic the most unusual circumstance we've experienced in our lifetime? And it calls for extraordinary measures, and I believe under the circumstances, trying to get money to these small businesses is necessary. Our goal with this loan program was to help them remain solvent and keep their employees on payroll so they can recover as soon as possible. So without this change, the PPP loan will fail to deliver to the maximum on this most basic objective. The Bipartisan Small Business Expense Protection Act will ensure that small businesses have the cash flow they need to survive today and prosper in the future. After all, we're not interested in handing out meals now only to slap people on the hands later for taking free food. The bill has bipartisan support here in the Senate. In fact, I introduced it with the chairman and ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senators Grassley and Wyden, as well as Senator Rubio, who chairs the Small Business Committee, and Senator Carper. It's gained the support of organizations that advocate for small businesses, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the National Federation of Independent Business. It's also been endorsed by groups in the financial services industry, including the Texas Society of Certified Public Accountants, the American Institute of CPAs, and the Independent Bankers of Texas. But most importantly, this bill is an answer to the real concerns that business owners are facing. As we work to strengthen our coronavirus response and recovery, that should be the guiding principle here in the Senate. Figure out what's working, what isn't, and act appropriately. This is a big contrast, Mr. President, between the approach we're seeing from our House colleagues. A few weeks ago, they passed a bill that was chock full of ideological policy proposals they know has absolutely no chance of gaining any traction in the Senate, but they didn't seem to care. They did a drive-by vote on a Friday and left town, and they haven't been back since. Tax breaks for blue state millionaires. They actually want to cut taxes on the richest people in America by reducing or raising the cap on the state and local tax deduction. They want to support marijuana banking, environmental justice grants, soil health studies, changes to election laws. Well, forget about solving the problem at hand. Our Democratic colleagues in the House with this so-called HEROES Act are attempting to use this pandemic as an opportunity to slip their liberal wish list into must-pass legislation. And they're eager to stick taxpayers with another $3 trillion tab. But this isn't going to happen. It has no chance of passing here in the Senate, and they actually know it. These unwanted, unaffordable, and frankly, laughable proposals are not the types of solutions America needs to recover from this crisis. Indeed, I think it would be wise for a number of folks in the House, Democratic leadership, to start listening to their constituents for a change, rather than try to figure out how do you posture and position yourself favorably for the next election. I've lost count of the number of video calls I've held, and I know my colleagues have had the same experience, with small business owners, medical professionals, farmers, educators, mayors, and representatives from nearly every corner of my state. And I appreciate the countless Texans who shared their feedback with me to help me do a better job on their behalf, and who will no doubt continue to point out the gaps that need to be filled in the months ahead, particularly when it comes to the next installment of a COVID-19 legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor.